in the free will of mankind, that we have real choice. And that makes sense to me, because if we have real choice, then the consequence makes sense, that there's an actual consequence that happens because of what we have decided to do. And for me, that plays into the whole Christian story. That's what that plays into the fall of mankind. He freely chose to not use his good gift of rationality in a way. He chose to abuse it rather than to use it for the goodness of knowing God and engaging in the world in the way that God had for him.
Now, there's always truth in what's being stated. And as far as that being a description of what man does and what man did, that's, as far as that goes, that's true. But notice what the connection is being made. The connection is being made is, if there is a divine decree that formed the fabric of time, so that God has a purpose in that happening, then there can no longer be any moral culpability. So if God decreed to make this universe as he decreed to make it, there could be no moral culpability. People need to understand something. The necessary theological correlation of believing this is that the cross had to be a secondary thought in the mind of God. I'm going to stop for a second to let you think that through. I'm going to let Rich think that through, because I think Rich was looking at something on the computer there. What did I just say? If, and this is going to be Lennox's argument, this is Mary Jo Sharp's argument, if the argument is that without autonomous free will, there can be no moral culpability. If there is a divine decree, then there is no autonomous human free will, therefore there is no moral culpability. Therefore, the cross of Christ had to be a secondary thought in the mind of God. And for many people, it is. For many people, it is. You can't have a high view of God accomplishing his purposes in redemption when you have man as the center of all things. It's just God doing the best he can to patch things up. But why do I say that? Why did I say this, the cross had to be a secondary thought? Think about it. If God had always intended in creation to accomplish his self-glorification, the triune God in the eternal covenant of redemption chose to redeem himself through the awesome reality of the incarnation and the self-giving of Christ and the union of a specific people to the divine Son, so that his death becomes their death, his resurrection, their resurrection. If that was the eternal purpose of God, then if you argue that the divine decree destroys moral culpability, then it also destroys the resultant glory from the very action of Jesus Christ on the cross. Because they're both the result of the divine decree. If the divine decree vitiates the one, it vitiates the other. If God had eternally chosen. And see, what's interesting is my Muslim friends make this an argument. They make this an argument. If Jesus knew that he was going to be resurrected, then what's the big deal? What's the problem? Missing the same point that my Christian friends miss. See, my Muslim friends miss the reality that Jesus gave himself voluntarily upon the cross, and that the prayer in the garden was not a fear of death. It was the sinless one looking at the reality of becoming sin for us. They miss that part. And so they dismiss the reality of the sufferings of Christ on that basis. My Christian friends miss the biblical teaching found in Genesis 50, found in Isaiah chapter 10, found in Acts chapter 4, that God can sovereignly predestine and decree to do something and then hold the men accountable who are involved in those actions based upon their acting upon the desires of their hearts. It is a biblical principle. God acts upon it. The church confesses it in Scripture. We must accept this. If you don't, the system falls apart, because this is giving us an understanding of why God has acted in the way that God has acted. it's right there.
And it caused a whole mess. And that for me, when you see Jesus going to the cross, he's acknowledging that we have made a mess of his good gifts.
Now, again, that's partially true. But if you take that perspective, then again, the cross is just a makeup action rather than central to God's eternal purpose. Rather than that it had always been God's purpose to demonstrate his great mercy in the incarnation, bringing about the glorification of the triune God. Now you've got it focused upon, well, man made a mess of things, and so now we have the cross. So you have a partial truth. Yeah, man did make a mess of things. And the cross is God's means of dealing with that. But that is a very, 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 very reduced view of the cross. A very reduced view of the cross.
That we have made a mess of that. And that there is a real consequence to what we've done. So that it's not just...
Notice, there is a real consequence to what we have done. So if there is a divine decree that... So think about it. From Acts chapter 4. God predestined what Herod and Pilate and the Romans and the Jews would do. They acted according to the predestining will of God in killing the innocent Son of God, the greatest evil of all time. The only innocent person who was ever killed. And innocent before the court of heaven. Unfallen in Adam. So they do exactly what God foreordained they were to do. So from this perspective, they had no guilt. It's as if they were innocent as the driven snow, and God put a big bad gun behind them and said, you do bad things, which of course is not the case. They acted. See, again, once you do not allow Scripture to hold together the multidimensional truth, because it has to be multidimensional. We're talking about the eternal and time. How do they interface? It's that beautiful diamond that has to be seen from multiple perspectives. But what holds that together? What holds that together is tota scriptura and sola scriptura. That's what holds it together. You take that out, boom, collapses down into a simplistic two-dimensional, it's either this or that. It's either man's free or he's a puppet. There can't be anything more. You can't have this once you take out sola scriptura and tota scriptura. And when Christian apologists pretend to bring the categories of worldly wisdom into their construction of theology, which is going the wrong way, their apologetics should be informed by their theology, not the other way around. But when they do that, collapses. That's what happens. You've got to hear this and understand this to be able to continue to appreciate the good things that many of these people say in other areas, but then to recognize, they're getting into that one area where, there's the tradition raising its ugly head, and yeah.
But let me just stay on that train of thought. So that there's a real consequence to what we've done, and it needs a real solution. It needs a real answer. So for me, that's what I see Jesus doing on the cross. He's providing a real answer to the abuse of our free will.
A real answer to the abuse of our free will. Well, if all that's saying, which is not what it's saying, but if all that was saying is that part of what the cross deals with is the abuse of our creaturely freedom, that much would be true. But that is a minor element of what is being accomplished at the cross, where God's wisdom is being displayed to the entire created universe. Where God's wrath is being displayed and his powers, it's all about God. And if your big focus is on, man messed up with his free will, his creaturely will, that's a problem. You're missing something very, 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 very important there.
And the abuse of our free will ends in the destruction of life. It ends in death. So what do you see Jesus doing on the cross? He's taking on the consequence of our free choices. And he's dying on the cross, taking that on. And then what he does is he rises from the dead to reverse the effects of our evil. Like, this is like, I said this in my talk, this is a productive treatment of the problem of evil. This is a productive treatment of the abuse of mankind's free will. All right, see, I'm getting going now.
Yeah. So the other side of this coin, though, is...
Now, is there a reversal of man's evil in the resurrection? Of course. But much more than that is the demonstration of the purpose of God in the salvation of a specific people in Jesus Christ. Titus chapter 2. This has been God's purpose from the beginning. God is glorifying himself to the salvation of a specific people and then conforming them to the image of his son. It's God's purpose. And again, you either looking from below, you see it through the lens of man. But Scripture allows us to look at it from God's perspective. It's God's purpose being worked out. So you have partial truths, but once they become disconnected from the overarching narrative of the whole revelation, which I would argue, again, if you say, well, you Calvinists, you've got all this highfalutin theology. I'm talking about how the Trinity here brings about self-glorification. I'm talking about how Christian theology as a whole has this beautiful coherence and consistency to it. And I'm saying to you that when you approach it from an anthropocentric position, you destroy the coherence, beauty, and consistency of the Christian message. That's really what we've been saying since the first Radio Free Geneva.
So that's the way God responds to the abuse of our freedom. But in what sense did God always know we were going to do that? Is there a sense in which actually we're just sort of playing out a pre-written script in that sense?
Yeah.
I think that's where...
Now, we've done Radio Free Genevas in response to Justin and this idea of this playing out of a pre-written script. Again, that's this. Instead of this, that's this. Instead of allowing for the biblical revelation of the relationship of time and eternity, seen, as I've said many times before, especially in the incarnation of Christ, where the eternal enters into time, which means that the events in time are real and are important and are a part of what God's purpose is. It's not just a script. That is this perspective. That is the flattened out perspective that robs so much of Scripture of its meaning. When you allow all of it to speak, you have the multifaceted diamond. Squish it down, it's not very pretty anymore. But this idea of merely a script would that be an accurate description of when Jesus says, Father, I'm only speaking the words the Father's given to me? Let's use his words elsewhere.